the public assurance meeting Monday the 25th of November here at the County Council Chamber. We'll probably be best by starting and just doing some quick introductions of who is around the room. I'll start again. Good afternoon everybody, and welcome to today's public assurance meeting on Monday the 25th of November at the County Council Chamber. We'll start by doing some introductions around the table. I'm Mark Jones, the Police and Crime Commissioner.
Stuart Tweedale, Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner.
Good afternoon, Bill Skelly, Chief Constable.
Good afternoon, Jason Harwin, Deputy Chief Constable.
Good afternoon, ACC Karen Wilson.
Good afternoon, Assistant Chief Officer Andrew White.
Good afternoon, Aubrey Williams, Research and Performance for the Commissioner.
And Malcolm Birch, Chief Executive.
Julie Flint, Chief Financial Officer.
Thank you for that, everybody. Going straight into the meeting, have we got any apologies, please? No apologies. Everybody appears to be here, so that tallies. So today's meeting, we're going to focus on some key areas of performance. So in particular, looking at a focus around crime rates, around complaints against Lincolnshire Police, and our integrated performance report. But before we do that, we have a section on public questions. Now, my understanding is that we haven't received any additional public questions other than one that just missed the deadline last time, which we wanted to make sure got covered. So over to you, Aubrey, to introduce that.
So the question is from Rosalind Jackson, and the subject is domestic violence in rural areas. A report by the National Rural Crime Network highlighted the issue of domestic abuse in rural areas. How many dedicated officers does Lincolnshire have dealing with this issue? And are there plans, in light of this report, to increase this team's resources?
So I'll pass in a moment to ACC Wilson, but in first response, right back when I was first appointed, we talked at the confirmation hearing in relation to rural crime, and the fact that I made clear there was that it wasn't just about these issues which affected our farming communities, such as hare coursing, the theft of plant and machinery, and issues in relation to their commercial activities, but that actually crime in its broadest sense were issues for people who lived in remote and rural areas, and that as a force, and as the Chief Constable of this force, I took very kind of seriously the issues that were affecting people. Since then, we've been doing a lot of work in all areas around our approach to those who live in our remote and rural communities, including how we address issues of domestic abuse. But for more specific details, I'll pass over to ACC Wilson.
Thank you, Chief. As the Chief's already outlined, domestic abuse is one of our key areas of concern, and this is identified through our own risk assessments about the priority areas for the force, but also through the Safer Lincolnshire Partnership. And so it's part of our core business, but we do take a holistic approach about how we deal with reports of domestic abuse. Lincolnshire Police is identified as a rural force, with the majority of our communities falling into this category, apart from Lincoln City. Therefore, we don't distinguish our approach to rural versus urban communities. The approach that we've adopted is to treat domestic abuse as everybody's business. With this in mind, we ensure that our staff are appropriately trained to ensure that they have the right skills to meet the needs of the victims and deal with the perpetrators. We work closely with partner agencies to ensure we have a holistic approach to victims and their families in order to keep them safe. Consequently, we don't have one specific team that deals solely with this type of offence, and the whole of operational and policing are involved at various levels to tackle this offending and support the victims. This goes from the staff within the force control room who take the calls, make the initial risk assessment and determine the right type and correct resource to deploy, through to response officers who are usually the first attendees at any incident and will deal with victims and offenders, and depending upon the seriousness of the incident, this may require further investigative response from CID or from specialists within our Protecting Vulnerable Persons unit. The Criminal Justice Unit then take responsibility to ensure that cases are brought through the criminal justice process, and we also employ the use of victim links to give support to our victims. Our Safeguarding Hub will deal with high risk and partnership approaches such as the multi-agency risk assessment conferences, and our analysts will explore wider strategic issues around patterns of behaviour. The report that the NCRN have produced, and in specific to Lincolnshire, will be discussed at a partnership group on the 2nd of December, where we look at the recommendations, the work that we're currently doing, and what gaps there might be that we could take forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. It was very helpful. I mean, I think it is worth making the point that the National Rural Crime Network is an organisation that's led by police and crime commissioners, that my Deputy Stewart sits on the executive of that nationally, and that we actually commissioned this report collectively. So rather than it being a report that was sort of done to Lincolnshire, if you like, it was done by Lincolnshire to make sure that we'd got that strength and depth of understanding and learning moving forward so that we could further improve the services. And I know that that is something that's at the heart of everything that is being done around domestic abuse. So moving on to item 4, the focus on crime rates, incorporating a report on violent crime, which will be uploaded as part of the paper pack to the website for people to look at in detail. I think it's fair to say that this is a national concern that has been raised, where trying to even raise the public's understanding of what we mean when we say the word violence, because people have a strong perception as to what that word means, but equally we break it down further into violence with injury, violence without injury. There's lots of different connotations, so it's quite important that people understand what area of your business is even being discussed in this. But also we obviously have seen rises through crime statistics in violent crime in all those areas. So I think it's very good timing really for you to explain a little bit about what those numbers mean, and actually provide some context to that, but also what the force's approach is to tackling that for the people of Lincolnshire.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. So welcome the opportunity to discuss issues in relation to our crime overall, and in particular this afternoon violent crime. And I will hand over to the Deputy Chief Constable in a few moments in order to go through in more detail the report we've prepared as a force in relation to violent crime. As you say, it's really important to get across to our public, our communities, what is meant by the numbers, because it has for a long time been the case that the force complies with national crime recording standards and the Home Office counting rules, and we have gone to considerable effort in the last 12 months to improve the ways in which we comply with those rules. But those rules are quite detailed, and to the member of the public may seem that they discuss things which are not necessarily the lay view of what violence is. Many of the rises that we have seen, certainly the substantial ones, sit within violence without injury, which sounds like a bit of a contradiction, but we will endeavour over the course of this afternoon try to explain in more detail what is meant by those different categories of violent crime. Suffice to say at this stage that within the large crime groups of what is recorded as violent crime, many of them are not someone being violently assaulted in the street, which may well be a public perception of what we would categorise as a violent crime. There are many, many other parts to it, such as internet-enabled offences, such as harassment online. Very serious things, and things that we need to record and things that we do record, but worth explaining that they fall into a category of violence without injury, and it's in some of those categories we've seen some of the most significant rises in recent times. Crime makes up over 1/3 of the overall crime that we record within Lincolnshire, and as such quite clearly is an area of focus for the entire force. So what I'd like to do now is pass over to the Deputy Chief Constable, who's going to take us through in more detail the report today.
Chief, thank you. What I propose to do, I'll give a bit more detail, again, the breakdown of the different types of crime within violent crime, because I think it is important people understand and actually show how much of it, how wide it actually covers some other offences. I'll put a bit of context in terms of the levels of crime, violent crime here compared to elsewhere in the country, because I think, again, that's really important, and particularly how much it risks our members of society and members of the public in Lincolnshire compared to elsewhere. Then I'll cover a little bit more in terms of some of the more detail around what we're actually doing at headliners, but then obviously I'll again hand across to the Assistant Chief Constable, Karen, to talk through again some more detail of what we're doing as well. So, okay, so I'll try and keep this as simple as I can. Violence against the person is broken down into two key areas. As the Chief touched on, there's violence with injury and there's violence without injury. So violence with injury ultimately covers these three main areas, which is homicide, i.e. murder, manslaughter, violence with injury, which is the assaults where there actually is an injury or ultimately some kind of other injury in terms of assault, occasion, actual bodily harm, through to, and this is where some legislation has changed over recent years, death and serious injury and lawful driving. So the driving offences traditionally were not part of violent crime, are now part of violent crime over the last couple of years. The one that does cause the confusion is the other one, the violence without injury. So as it said, as the Chief has said already, that covers and importantly covers an area which was not recorded as it is now up till April last year, which is stalking and harassment. And then the others, violence without injury, again, could be assault, but there's no injury, no physical injury, all the way through to modern slavery, child neglect, and a number of other types of offences. So you can see straight away, one of the challenges we're facing policing is the compare and contrast of where we were to where we are now. So the way it's recorded, particularly around the stalking and harassment, has changed the way it's recorded, and just as importantly, as part of the work that's been done nationally to make sure that we have got integrity in crime recording, violence is one that traditionally was under-recorded. And that's not intentionally, but it's a case of where people intentionally make a complaint of an assault or of other violence, but actually, if we do have an allegation of assault or other violence now, we would record it even if the person was not willing to support an investigation. So what does that actually mean? You know, as a resident of Lincolnshire, and obviously as a person that's responsible for keeping the public of Lincolnshire safe, I think it is important to say straight away your chances of being a victim of violence with injury is 2%. So 2% we are ultimately, again, one of the lowest levels of force in the country in terms of safety, in that sense of positive. So the chances of being a victim here are a lot less here compared to elsewhere. And importantly, violence without injury, it's 0.8% chance of you being a victim of violence without injury. So again, that's important we put it in context. What does that actually mean though, in terms of levels of crime here? Well, as we said already, as a result of the work that was done here over the last 18 months, where we did have an inspection around crime data integrity, it was recognised, in line with other forces in the country, we wasn't recording as many violent crime offences as we should be. So there's been a significant amount of work done over the last 12 months, and as we speak now, we're involved in a re-inspection of crime data integrity. And straight away, we are seeing an increased levels of violent crime recording, which is important because obviously the recording helps us make some decisions as well. In terms of violence with injury, again, that makes up 29% of our ultimate violent crime. Again, within that, and it links into the conversation about rural crime and domestic abuse, 27% of violence with injury is linked to domestic abuse. So straight away highlights again there the importance of the work we do around domestic abuse, not just in terms of addresses the issue around the vulnerability and potential exploitation of individuals, but straight away make sure we're addressing some of the violent crime related issue around that. Again, likewise, then you look at a violence without injury, that makes up 46% of the overall levels of violent crime, but importantly, 73% of that is linked to domestic abuse. So as Kevin touched on there, domestic abuse is a key priority, not just for Lincolnshire Police, but certainly from the Community Safety Partnership. And again, it's an area of work that we must continue to do everything we can, not just in terms of making sure victims have got confidence to report, but then making sure our response is right by having professional, committed and officers and staff that show empathy and ultimately give everything we can the confidence that individual to come forward. Likewise, and again without going into the detail of some of the work we're doing already, perpetrator work, again, is one nationally that's been recognised as more work should be done. And again, we are running programmes here around the perpetrator programme. Again, not just changing and supporting victims, but making sure we're actually changing the behaviour of perpetrators as well. Now, within the report, which I know will be circulated, one of the concerns that's always been and is reported nationally is about knife crime. So again, knife crime is an issue for the county. We are seeing increased levels of knife crime, but I want to put it in context and what that actually means in terms of day-to-day business. So at the minute, if you look over the last 12 months, there's been 311 crimes relating to knife crime offences, and that's actually 63 more than there was in the previous 12 months. So it is an issue for us. Again, Karen will touch on some of the work that's been doing, both particularly here on the Lincoln side of the county, but just in points for the wider work that we're doing both locally, regionally and nationally as well. My last bit that I'll cover for now is in terms of outcomes. So in terms of when we have a crime recorded, how many are we getting to a position where the person's being charged or reported on summons, what would some previously be described as a positive outcome? Now, firstly, and this is where the domestic abuse piece comes in, is that we know very well that ultimately victims may call the police, but not necessarily when any action taken apart from resolving that issue there and then. And a lot of the time that could result in not the person being willing to pursue and support an investigation and then ultimately a charge and person taken to court. We must remember that, because ultimately in terms of the outcomes that we face, clearly we respond quickly to domestic abuse, certainly emergency related incidents of domestic abuse. The issue that we face is that we still have a significant number here that are not willing to support the investigation once we've responded. And it is an area of work that we're looking at and continue to look at to make sure that, is that a reason the person's not willing to support the investigation because they haven't got confidence in the police investigation? Is it a case of they haven't necessarily got that stage, got the confidence and courage to be able to take that next step, which is really, really important, really difficult decision? Or is it the third party, is the criminal justice system itself is letting the potential victim down, and therefore they're not willing to go through that, particularly if they've been a victim previously? Again, that work is ongoing and certainly will no doubt will be subject to a public conversation as in the coming months and years as well. However, in terms of outcomes, if you look at violence without injury, out of all those, we get to a position where 11% of all those that are reported and supporting the investigation are ultimately go through a court sanction, whether that be reported on summons or ultimately charged to court, and obviously in a trial. In terms of violence with injury, 17% get a positive outcome. Now that might seem very low, but compared to other parts of the country, again, it's up with the national averages in terms of that area of business. The important bit being is that because of the levels of crime, as are being reported nationally, certainly around violence, have continued to increase. Again, as the Chief touched on there, crime is a third, realistically, of our demand, and actually violent crime makes up 36%. So it is a big area of business that we need to make sure we do everything we can and are doing. And again, I'll let Karen touch a little bit more on some of the detail of what we're actually doing in terms of keeping our public safe.
Quite happy to pause for a second, Commissioner, because that's the sort of introductory kind of comments made. If there was any particular question, if not, then I would move on to talking about some of the actions that are taking place.
Okay, thank you for that, and that was a really helpful introduction. Has anybody else around the table got any questions on that before we move on? Okay.
Okay, thank you. As the deputy said, one of the areas that we're focused on is around knife crime. Although it's not huge numbers, it has shown an increase. And the violence that's increased, certainly across on the west area, which is Lincoln City and Gainsborough, Grantham, has been brought us together to see what we can do more proactively and have a much more holistic approach to tackling the violence in this particular area. One of the things that we've introduced is Operation Raptor, which is an operation which we will roll out across the rest of the county, but for now we've just concentrated on some of the key areas in the west of the county. And Operation Raptor, OpRaptor, is looking at violence against the person, which includes knife crime possession offences, although that doesn't figure into the violence figures themselves. But if we don't tackle the possession of knife crime, then it will potentially roll over into becoming a violent offence. So this operation was launched in October, where we're taking a 4Ps approach to it, which is about prevention, looking at how do we actually prevent people taking up violence as a means to an end in itself, and that's education through the schools. So we've got mini police involved, we've got cadets, etc. involved about some of that prevention work. It's about pursuit, which is pursuing offenders who are committing offences of violence. And we've done a number of operations executing warrants across the whole of the West County, where we've had over 60 people arrested in the last 2 months, and we've recovered over 50 weapons, from machetes to Stanley knives to all sorts of other weapons, baseball bats, etc. This operation, when we brought people together, what we do want to do is prevent them going on to commit further offences in the future. So it's about taking them through the court processes, working with the CPS to make sure we get the right criminal justice outcomes, but also if they're not going through the court process, because as Jason's mentioned, not everybody wants to support a prosecution, it's how do we actually take that forward without taking them through the court process. One of the things that we're looking at introducing is a safeguarding hub, with more investment in the safeguarding hub, which then will look at some of those domestic abuse type violent offences and what we can do to actually shift the behaviours that we come across in there. So the whole violence issue is not just about nighttime economy type violence. That's just a small part of it. Domestic abuse violence is one of the big parts of it. The other issue that we've got to contend with in some of our operations at the moment is around county lines, which is we're a big importer in this county of that trend of county lines whereby young people are being trafficked into the county by drug dealers to sell drugs, and this does bring with it quite a bit of violence, which impacts on our communities. So there's we have to balance up the vulnerability of some of the people who are being brought in to sell drugs in these areas, especially if they're being trafficked from children's home right across the country. Certainly we've seen them coming from West Midlands, London, Luton, etc. into our area. So how do we treat them as they're both victims and perpetrators? And it's about getting the balance right with that. And that has seen quite a lot of police activity in Lincoln City. So we've had some quite big seizures of drugs as well in that area, which all impacts on how we address this. The other issue over this last year is that we've had quite a lot of homicides. You'll see from the violent crime figures that we've had 17 homicides this year, which we had 3 this time last year. And that is, there's no particular patterns, there's no particular, when we do the analyst piece of work, there's nothing that jumps out to say if we did X, we would start and prevent this happening right across the board. We've got people who've come into the county on holiday and they've been subjected to domestic abuse homicides, which in people who are high risk of domestic abuse within the county, we put a lot of safeguarding measures around them, but we can't manage that for people who come from out of the county, right down to people who've got addiction issues and have committed violent offences while they've fallen out with each other in addiction situations, to drug dealing, gang type offences which have happened in Gainsborough. And we've got a number of different operations which are tackling all of these different types of operations because there isn't a particular pattern. So each area has its own response to it. But what we will be doing from next month going forward is having a strategic lead for violence which will oversee all of those different strands of domestic abuse, nighttime economy, violence and knife crime offences, to make sure that we're getting the best approach that we can to Lincolnshire's tackling of this particular problem.
So a part of that approach then is looking at what's called the 4 Ps in relation to the crime reduction toolkit as published by the College of Policing and used by forces across the country. Essentially that's around prevention, pursuit, protect and prepare. And under each of those headings, the forces engaged in a number of different activities in order to try and intervene and therefore prevent, in its kind of general sense, violent crime from taking place. We are absolutely kind of clear as a force executive that while there are areas in relation to the reported information that are down to our better compliance with accounting rules, and it will be next year before we have a year-on-year comparison. For those may recall that the Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services conducted their inspection at the end of last calendar year, and we started making the changes immediately that report was available. So throughout this calendar year, the force has been improving its compliance, and therefore we've seen upwards of 30% increases in some of our crime categories as a result of that activity. It will be next year before you have comparative information, where we fully expect to see some plateauing or some evening out of the month-on-month crime figures. Even taking that as accepted, there are clearly issues of violence within the county which it is our duty to respond to and to ensure that we've got an appropriate amount of intervention taking place. I don't want necessarily to go through all of the things which are contained within the report, because that will be published and it will be there for those to see. But I would invite both my colleagues, if there are particular aspects within the 4Ps approach that they wish to highlight, then invite them to do so before taking further questions.
Yeah, Chief, just a couple from me. Again, it's highlighted in the report. Again, clearly in terms of addressing violence, that's not just a policing issue, it's a wider partnership issue. And again, within the community safety partnership here, the recognised issue around domestic abuse, I've already touched on that. There's a county-wide action plan around domestic abuse, and again, as Karen's touched on, the result of the recent rural crime issue within that will be discussed, and again, the action plan updated. I think the important bit here for me is that we recognise the nighttime economy is a demand on violent crime, but sometimes it's not just the only issue. And whilst we need to address the nighttime economy, particularly we can see 64% of the nighttime economy offences are linked to alcohol. The work that we do with licensing, which is a key partner within what we do here in Lincolnshire, will continue to do that work, not just in terms of reacting to and potentially looking at closure orders for premises, but more importantly, making sure the door staff are trained, equipped, and again, work with the landlords and licenses to make sure they're doing everything they can to reduce the likelihood of a person being in a risk of violence in their premises as well. The other part for us, as touched on there, is education. We recognise again and again the investment within the force, as Karen touched on there, linking into the fantastic work we've done around the mini police here, is actually making sure we're working with schools to educate young people, again, the consequences of violent crime, whether being a victim or a perpetrator, and particularly around knife crime, because as we know very well from the national research that's been done, if young people are carrying knives, there's actually more chance of being a victim than being a perpetrator, because the reality is they might have the knife taken off them. So the work we are doing here is to make sure that's understood, and again we'll continue to do that, particularly taking account of we've got areas where clearly the risk could be greater than other parts because of the makeup of that community as well.
And just touching on some of the work that we're doing with partnerships such as trading standards, we're recognising that knives which are being sold tend not to be sold to young people from the big chains. They tend to access them from either within the home borough if they are buying them. They're from small independent retailers. So we've been doing lots of work and lots of operations with the likes of trading standards to do some test purchasing, and then we can work with those offenders to make sure that they know what the legal requirements are. They ask the question about, are you over 25? And if they're not going to comply and work with us, then we will actually take some enforcement action. But we want to prevent this happening and get that education out there first.
Thank you very much for that. Sort of a difficult question, this one, to answer, which is always going to be difficult, but nevertheless I think it needs asking. I fully accept that the way that crime is recorded will have had an impact on this, no question about it. I suppose it's trying to get a feel for how big a difference. So have we got any kind of feel for, you know, has there been an increase in violent crime on top of the change to the way crime is recorded, or do we believe that it's pretty much on a parity with where it was a year ago? And I appreciate these things are always difficult, but it doesn't sit necessarily well to say, well, we'll have to wait a year until we get that to understand that. So a bit more around that would be great.
Certainly, Commissioner. What we can say is that if you look at the forces across the country that have had their crime data integrity inspections, then the increases in their recorded crime for violence are on a par with ours. For some forces, it has been greater. So there is a very clear correlation between the inspection programme and the increases that forces then report to their recorded crime. Therefore, kind of taking that as much as we can out of the equation, we are left with the question of, and is there any other increases that are taking place which are reflective of an actual increase in real crime, so that are taking place in our communities? The analysis that we've been able to do would suggest that there are, but they are much smaller effects than the big jumps of 15, 20, 30% that we see for things such as the stalking and harassment figures, which then affect the overall violence without injury figures. So we have seen what we believe is a genuine rise in, for example, bladed weapon and robbery. But these are smaller percentage rises in the actual reporting. And these are the things on which we are focusing a lot of our activity. Equally, we genuinely believe that the confidence to report around sexual offending and domestic abuse, as well as the various domestic abuse offender diversion programs and victim support programs, continue to encourage the public to come forward and report when they've been the victim of these crimes. So they are genuinely rising again against the backdrop of the better compliance with counting rules. So the shorter answer to the question, albeit it is a complex question, is that yes, we do genuinely feel that we have seen some rises, as has many other parts of the country, in relation to things such as knife crime, robbery, domestic abuse and sexual offending, and they form the core of the focus that the team are bringing to the 4 Ps and the way in which we try and prevent those things from happening in the future. So that's my initial response, but again, I'll sort of ask my colleagues if they want to add to that.
Yeah, so part of our understanding, again, we are working with the forces that obviously went early with the CDI inspections and obviously the resulting action, again, to see if they get a gauge. I think interesting, look at overall crime, actually, for the first month we've seen for a long time, crime levels have started to come down again, so whether we get into the new norms of what this is the levels that we expect or what we'll see over the next few months, we will certainly see. I think the important bit is no matter what levels we're at anyway, we've got to make sure that firstly, if a crime is reported, we record it. That's the first bit, because it's around public confidence. And the second is making sure then we do an appropriate response, that it's a timely response, and again, making sure if the person is particularly vulnerable, because again, you can appreciate particularly people that are a repeat victim, or the level of serious nature of the offence is significant, then clearly we may need other people to support us in terms of that investigation and support to the victims as well. So again, back to the question, yeah, we're still working out, is it a genuine increases with the numbers that the Chief touched on there? The exact levels is not known at the moment, but again, we'll continue to work with that, and I'm certain of, not in the next 12 months, but certainly over the coming months, we'll see that difference anyway. The important bit from our side is no matter what the figures are, one victim is too many. We'll do everything we can to continue to support and make sure we do everything we can to stop them being a victim in the future as well.
Okay, thank you for that. I think something else that had been picked up elsewhere before today was around the fact that we've seen a dip in some of the antisocial behaviour numbers at the same time as we've seen a rise in the violence without injury numbers. And I understand there's some reclassification. So in effect, rather than some new incidents happening, they're just not being recorded in one category and are being recorded in another. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's correct. Again, and again, without going into the fine detail in the report, if you look in the report, it highlights the time when ultimately crime recording standards changed. We started to see an increase in violent crime recording and a decrease in antisocial behaviour. So areas of antisocial behaviour previously wouldn't be recorded as an antisocial behaviour incident and were no longer as antisocial behaviour incident, it's actually a crime being recorded. To be fair, that was actually welcome within policing, because relatively always been differentiated between a crime and antisocial behaviour is so fine, relatively a lot of time there's criminality involved in it anyway.
Excellent, thank you for that. Just going back to Raptor, which seems like a really good initiative. I mean, one of the challenges, I think, around when you're tackling particularly bladed articles, if you're proactive in using whether it's stop and search or just intelligence-led operations to actually find those weapons, it doesn't necessarily mean that an incident's occurred where the weapons have been used, but nevertheless you're then recording the fact that a crime has been committed where somebody's had that. So obviously what we should potentially see, because you're being more proactive, is that these numbers will go up. but potentially one would hope that that will then mean that some of the violence would then not be there but as a result. So I'm interested in particularly just your views on that, you know, because in some respects you making more seizures of weapons is a good thing, but it does obviously drive the figures in that direction. But also what this will do, should we expect to see any difference in the number of stop and searches that have been used across the county?
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. You're absolutely right. The more proactive we are as a police force in any particular aspect of policing, the more that we're likely to generate those crime figures, because it's proactive policing that actually brings that to light. What I am hoping, though, is that not only does it generate the figures because we are criming those things, but they're lower level crimes, and what we are doing is preventing more serious offences in the future. So if we take possession of knives, of weapons, and deal with the offenders for that, I'd much rather deal with that and increase our figures there than actually deal with somebody who's been physically harmed. And then we've got additional victims that fall out of this, whereby with some of the approaches that we have with OpRaptor, we don't have additional victims from this particular area. So we are, sorry, Chief. Yeah. So we are very conscious of that, but we will be able to separate that out when we start doing our reporting and analysis on this, about where there would be victims which are equated to some of the crimes which come out of OpRaptor.
Thank you. Yeah, and I suppose by way of adding kind of further kind of context to that, as you say, Commissioner, sort of being in possession of a bladed weapon or offensive weapon is very often an issue that's found by the police. So it's one where we're kind of almost generating the crime itself. What it does allow us to do is, first of all, intercept someone who might be about to offend and use that weapon in some kind of violent crime, and ultimately may well prevent a murder or homicide kind of taking place. It also allows us to divert people into appropriate programs for them to try and prevent them from carrying a weapon in the future. Some of the information we have, which is contained in the report, tells us that the current breakdown of the offenders in the last 12 months, roughly a third are under the age of 18, roughly a third are between 19 and 29. So 2/3, being in a relatively young age group, and that has meant that we've been able to put a number of these offenders into diversionary programs, such as those who are kind of doing Futures for Me, which was formerly known as Positive Futures and Youth Offending Service, have been able to divert people into their programs, as well as putting 12 young people through the Behind the Blade program, which is designed to encourage people who are carrying weapons and who are found to be in possession of an offensive weapon to rethink their approach, and to see that the consequences of that could be very serious indeed. So part of the proactivity allows us to intervene early and divert people. Our consequences arise in the recorded figures, which again may give the impression that it's a more violent community. In many ways, it is the police taking a very positive action.
And just on that point around stop and search, because by no means am I saying additional stop and search is a bad thing. I'm just trying to understand what we're likely to see as a result.
Yes, we've already seen the numbers of stop search figures increasing. I haven't got the breakdown of what that actually looks like linked directly to OpRaptor at the moment, because we are just seeing that right across the board as we're freeing up and starting to reduce some other demand by using things like our mobile data terminals. We're having officers out there who are much more proactive in addressing that. We're also having them targeting areas where we've got county lines, etc. So again, increases in stop and search will be seen in those intelligence-led direction that we give to our officers. What we are seeing, though, is that the links to arrest rates regarding stop and search has increased as well. So for me, that does show that we're actually stopping and carrying out searches on the right people in the right areas.
We absolutely acknowledge that stop and search can be a very sensitive issue for communities, and we have our independent advisory group as well as our own ethics panel, and the approach that we're taking, we make every effort to ensure that we're doing that with a community as opposed to being felt to be doing it against the community. I'd have to say that so far my understanding is that we have great community support for the use of stop and search as a power in order to intervene, not just for offensive weapons but for other issues such as drugs. And I would hope and intend that we can carry on having that level of support as we use that technique in the future.
Okay, and you know, I would note that nationally, obviously, violence has been a focus where, I mean, £100 million has been sort of focused at developing, in particular, violence reduction units, focusing on the key 18 force areas that have suffered the most with violence. And now, it's always frustrating when investment doesn't come to our county and to the police in particular, but nevertheless, it's a double-edged sword, if I use that really terrible phrase in this regard, to actually say that we weren't one of the 18, therefore we're not seen as having that sort of high-profile problem, but nevertheless it does mean that we weren't therefore given the investment to tackle it. And I think what will happen as the months develop, some of the learning that comes out of those violence reduction units will cascade down, and I know that we'll be keen, both from the Police and Crime Commissioner's Office but also from the force, to obviously take part in that and learn what we can. And I would assume that will feed in ultimately to the process that you've described to me about having those key people dealing with that. I suppose the other element for me is tackling the fear of crime and violent crime in particular, because we know certain parts of our county disproportionately are affected by fear of crime rather than the reality, and we will always tackle the reality, but as partners, I guess, not just policing, we need to understand that fear of crime and how we address that. So any comments on that would be great.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. In relation to the strategic group for violence, there will be a key element of that will be our communication and our confidence with our communities to ensure that we get messages out there. We have a campaign to raise the issues but not raise the fear, and we need to ensure that we're very subtle with that, because it can, you're quite right, it can go one way or the other if we're quite clunky with how we address that. So that will be part of one of the key strategies that we'll take forward in that group.
Thank you very much. So I guess just I would just open whether, in addition to obviously what we've discussed, I suppose the key thing is there's lots of elements of a plan there as to how you're moving that forward. If there's sort of anything else you want to say about how the force approach to tackling that, then we can move on.
Yeah, Commissioner, just I suppose to finalise, as the Assistant Chief said there, we've obviously recognised the importance of this piece of work, not just in terms of domestic abuse, but the wider issue around violence. And again, one of the things we are doing, whilst we have got leads for knife crime, domestic abuse, actually an overall picture of violence is important to us, and therefore appointing somebody to lead that piece of work. Again, to just make sure there's some connectivity between the local playing with the force and then, more importantly, with a partnership, is one that we'll continue to do. And certainly a conversation with heads of commands on Friday last week is about how we're going to pull that plan together. So again, we're very happy to share that in the coming months, and particularly we want to bring it here as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it is really important that obviously we, as representing the public, that we do understand what the approach is that the force is taking, and obviously that we understand where we go to with the crime data integrity to make sure that we've got a grip of those numbers and understand where they are. So we should see that level out when we sort of hit that end of the first year cycle. But I think it is important, as far as public confidence goes, that we publish this data and information. So thank you very much for that. We are a little bit ahead of the timings, but I think we've covered everything that we needed to cover in that section, unless anybody else has got Anything to add? No? Good. So moving on then to the focus on complaints. So this is looking at complaints specifically against the force and understanding the way that all exists, and then the force approach to tackling that. We know that there are changes coming in the new year as to how forces can tackle complaints and deal with that, and the relationship between the Office of Police and Crime Commissioner and the force in dealing with this. But at the moment, just for clarity for anybody who is listening, the OPCC, myself as Police Crime Commissioner, oversees complaints directly against the Chief Constable, but other complaints against the organisation are dealt with by the force. And over to you to explain further.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. Yeah, as you say, a complaint made against an officer or member of staff is dealt with by myself, much of it I delegate, as is the case for forces right across the country, to the Deputy Chief Constable, who is kind of known as the appropriate authority. But essentially, complaints that are made are recorded through our Professional Standards Department, and they are subject to a number of different levels of scrutiny, not least of which by the Deputy himself, but also through the Independent Officer for Police Complaints, also through our IAG, and also dip sampling that takes place throughout the course of the year, all of which is designed to try as best as possible ensure that a complaint system is easily accessible for the public, so that anyone who does feel that they haven't received the service they should, or indeed anything more serious than a service level complaint, can be made, will be heard, will be recorded, and will be passed on for a resolution, which may involve investigation, and indeed that could be done independently of the force itself. Those particular kinds of complaint are very few in any given year, and in fact the total number of complaints that we received and recorded in Lincolnshire for the financial year 18-19 was 571, which, putting that kind of in context for an organisation of just shy of kind of 2,000 people when you include our G4S colleagues, and a population of 750,000, just over 1.5 a day is the sort of level that comes into us. Many of those complaints being, as I say, issues of service delivery or service failure, not necessarily conduct. What we are clear, though, is that we have seen some rises, and that it's, as is the case with our issues of crime recording, it's around trying to understand those rises, and particularly when they are in relation to conduct, because we are very clear that we want an organisation that follows the values of policing in Lincolnshire: professionalism, respect, integrity, dedication and empathy, and that those values are demonstrated and not just words on a bit of paper. And therefore the conduct of people is something that we take a great deal of interest in, and leadership. As I say, most of these areas are on a day-to-day basis dealt with through the direction of the Deputy Chief Constable, and what I'd like to do is invite him to say a few words about the report, which again I'm imagining will be part of the public pack that, yes, that the public will have an opportunity to see. So Jason, over to you.
Chief, thank you. So again, a bit of context first. I think the Chief's touched on the different ways people can report a complaint to us. Again, just emphasise, it can be in writing, it can be a call into the organisation, it can be online, or ultimately it can through the Independent Police Complaints Commission can actually do it as well. So there's a variety of ways people can make a complaint. Yes, we have seen an increase in numbers of complaints. Importantly, when we get a complaint, that complaint can be about a number of allegations. So again, when you start looking at numbers, this is where it can get a bit complicated. In the sense of one complaint could be one allegation, but actually one complaint could be numerous allegations of what's not been done realistically. In terms of what that means for the last 12 months, so we've had, if you look at it here, we've had 83 more complaints than we had in previous 12 months, which gets the numbers the Chief talked about, 571. And in terms of allegations, we've had 88 more allegations. Now, again, importantly, part of this is about making sure we effectively record. Again, we have got timescales to record complaints, Again, that is inspected through the Independent Police Complaints Commission. And again, the important piece there is ultimately that 97% of our complaints are recorded in line with 10 days, which obviously is the one that we should be aiming to deliver. Again, that is seen as good practice nationally. And again, importantly from our side, because we are seeing the increase in complaints, we've got increased scrutiny from the IOPC anyway to make sure that we are recording right, but just importantly what we're doing about it. Over the last 12 months, what we are seeing, and again there's some correlation to public satisfaction around this, is we are seeing more complaints. Nearly 50% of our complaints relate to what's described as other neglect or failure of duty. What does that mean? It's around general satisfaction about not meeting the public expectations, and just as importantly, it's where we're potentially not doing as the member of the public would expect to do in terms of investigation, and importantly, not necessarily keeping updated what we're doing around that investigation. When we've looked at those complaints, the majority of those complaints, over 70%, are resolved at first point of contact. So the complaint comes in, goes to our professional standards department, working with the local commands, we can resolve that straight away, what's happened and not happened. That's important because it gives in context of, in terms of serious nature of the complaint, it's lower level, it's still a complaint, we need to get it right, but it's lower level that we can resolve there and then. Interestingly, the work that we're doing around public satisfaction at the moment, which is led by the Commander in the West, Nicky Mayo, again is highlighting that in terms of public satisfaction, in terms of our response, not necessarily complaints, but in terms of are they happy the way we dealt with a particular incident, we've seen a decline, particularly around follow-up and investigations. So straight away, we are putting a connection of the complaints coming in because we're not getting it right in terms of keeping people updated, or just as importantly, in terms of our initial response, it's not what expected. So there is more work that we're doing in terms of addressing those areas. The Chief touched on about scale of complaints as well. So one of the things that we're particularly keen, in line with our values, is making sure we reduce the amount of complaints regarding civility, clearly the issues around impoliteness and intolerance, because that can't be accepted. It's not part of our values within the organisation. And importantly, from the work that we've been doing through the complaints learning process, again, the number of complaints are starting to reduce. Again, it's an area that we'll continue to do work with, but importantly, the complaint system exists firstly to give people confidence that if they're not happy with the service they've got, they can make a complaint and something's done with it. But importantly for our staff, it's about learning. So if we've not got it right, we need to learn. And clearly if people continue to make the same mistakes or intentionally do conduct that's not acceptable, then that's when the process should kick in terms of appropriate enforcement. Things to be aware of, we do monitor that if we get lots of complaints about single officers or teams. So again, that is regularly reviewed on a monthly basis with the relevant commands. And again, if an officer triggers 3 complaints in a 12-month period, again, there is a conversation with the Professional Standards Department with the individual line management and inspector levels of that individual to say, is okay, what's happening here? And again, if there is issues, try and resolve it at the first point of contact if we can. And if we can't, if there's a pattern, then we'll do some further work. And again, depending on what that issue is at the same time. As you touched on, Commissioner, we are going to go through a period of change, significant change around police regulations. So whilst the fine detail is still being worked out, if we'll be very honest, the reality is the way we record complaints going into February next year, we will see an increase in complaints because the way we recorded. Now, to be fair, we've put ourselves in, I think, a very strong position because we record all the allegations, which is not in common with the force areas. So again, straight away, a positioning of where we are compared to where we might be in 12 months' time, we're in a better position to understand demand on our teams and the wider bit, what that means in terms of the wider impact on the public as well. The reality, though, is February is not far away, as we know very well. Again, whilst the legislation is set out about the role of the Police and Crime Commission, the role of the force, and we've made a decision of what levels that will be at, which is in keeping with the majority of other forces, in terms of actually how it's going to work and the impact in some of these dynamics and the processes. Again, that's fine detail still to be worked out, and particularly around the regulations as well. So, an area really important to us. This is about, again, public confidence. It is about recognising if we've not got it right, we need to get it right. And the important bit from the service is recognising the correlation between some of the issues we're getting in complaints, how we're seeing that in terms of performance around public satisfaction.
So, by way of summary, for an organisation that deals every day with people in situations of stress and distress and occasionally with situations of conflict, the actual numbers of complaints are, I think, refreshingly low. About half, 49%, are in relation to the quality of the service that the individual received, and most of their issues are around things such as the follow-up to the initial point of contact and not being kept informed, which is information that's actually borne out within our public satisfaction information as well, that where we do really well is our initial points of contact, where unfortunately we do far less well is being able to keep someone informed, or at least meet the expectations that they have about how often and how much they are going to be kept informed. So we're very clear about the areas for improvement that we have. And as the Deputy has said, in areas of conduct, such as incivility, we've seen some good reductions in the numbers that have come to us in terms of complaints. Finally, I would say that by way of reassurance, as I mentioned at the outset, the Independent Office for Police Conduct is one of those bodies who looks at us. They also are a body that can step in and do independent investigations of their own. And consistently, their feedback to us as a force is that they are highly praiseworthy of our approach. We are one of the outstanding forces when it comes to the way in which we record our complaints and the timeliness of how they are dealt with. And therefore that kind of independent cross-check is quite a healthy position for us to be in. Just as we said, one victim is unacceptable, one complaint is unacceptable, so we will always try and reduce in those areas where we can. That said, the picture as it stands at the moment in context is one where there's a lot of good work being done by the force, and there's clear areas where we know we can improve.
Thank you very much for that. I think it's obvious to most people that if you're in the business that you are, often dealing with people at their lowest ebb or in the most stressful situations and lots of things going on, there will be occasion where things won't go in the way that they necessarily hoped and expected, and that may result in a complaint. I think in particular I welcome the focus particularly around the incivility and those areas, because that is something that's largely within the gift of the organisation to try and impact, and so the focus on that I think is useful. I think what's really important we've got to recognise is that not only have we got a new system coming, but the way complaints are categorised changes, which nationally we're sort of expecting there to be a significant number of things recorded as complaints that previously maybe wouldn't have been. And so there's going to be a challenge there nationally as to how that's managed and what that looks like. And I think we will be in the position that we've been in this year with crime data integrity, where over the next year potentially it becomes quite difficult to monitor whether we've got a genuine increase or not. And I think that's something we'll need to work on to really make sure we're under the skin of it, to know that we've got a grip of that as well as we can. I also meet with the IOPC, and again, I would back up what you said. They are complementary of the force's approach to dealing with complaints, and that is something that consistently sort of wanted to let us know. But no, I welcome the report. Thank you very much, and obviously we continue to monitor that. So thank you. Moving on from that section, we move into the integrated performance report, which again, the main report of this will be put online so the public can see it, but over to you to talk to it.
Thank you, Commissioner. The report is 25 pages long. It has a number of annexes to it at the end, so I will very much be kind of guided by yourself, Commissioner, and others in the room as to what elements you would wish to focus on, as there is a great deal of rich commentary within the context of the report itself. The first sections are dealing with our crime levels, and much of it focused on violent crime, which has been the subject of an earlier item this afternoon. So it was not my intention to go into any further detail in relation to the first section, but happy if there was a specific additional question to take it. No, okay. In which case, the second area is looking at some of the demand measures that are placed upon the force, particularly in relation to force control room, and then the incident allocation. So essentially, a member of the public seeks the service of the police, or an incident takes place about which we are notified, such as a road collision. And then the control room is the area where an appropriate resource is found and allocated to attend if it's felt attendance is in the correct response. There are a couple of things that I would wish to kind of say in relation to this picture, just again by some way of context. First of all, there is undoubtedly an issue which we are very conscious of in terms of an overall rising picture of demand for police services. And that comes from members of the public, it also comes from partner agencies, and there has been quite a significant amount of work that's been taking place and continues to take place in order to try and better manage that demand, or indeed more appropriately point that demand in the direction of a partner service who could deal with it. A prime example being mental health issues, which is a topic which occurs later in the report. But essentially, if you have a large amount of demand that's increasing and a fixed number or declining number of resources, then it is fairly straightforward to understand it's going to take you longer to get stuff. That's one of the consequences. And it's something that I've done my best to be open with the public regarding, that you will see attendance times rise for as long as the demand rises and the resources remain fixed or falling. We would hope at some point to get a longer term solution to the second of those areas, but we absolutely are focused in the here and now on what we can do to better manage demand. And it might be worth sort of pointing to a couple of examples in relation to that management of demand that are ongoing, and that, largely speaking, the ACO, Andrew White, has been working with the control room to implement, one around how we manage shoplifting and the other one how we're managing concern for welfare. Andrew.
Yes, thank you, Chief Constable. So since the 1st of November, we've been managing all shop theft reports in a different way. Previously, officers and PCSOs would routinely attend retailers' premises just to see if there was evidence to be gathered and take the crime record in person. This was very labour intensive. We have 6,000 shop thefts per year within Lincolnshire. So now we have tried to lessen that demand, but in doing so, focus officers' time and resources on being able to apprehend offenders. So we now have an online shop theft portal, so that when a crime is reported, the retailer can fill out their crime report, which may include the known name of the suspect, or include images of the suspect that they have taken from their CCTV system. If we have a name of the offender, then that is then immediately allocated out to officers. If we have an image of the offender, then that is put through our ID sort process for identification and then subsequent allocation to officers. What this means is we are now managing over 54% without a direct allocation to police officers, whereas previously that was a figure higher than 90%. What this allows is where we have an investigative line of inquiry, such as the name or a usable image of the offender, that officers can focus on the apprehension of the suspect for further action. We believe that that's going to make a considerable positive impact without any detriment to the public or to retailers themselves. I should also make clear that if there is ever any aggravating factor in the crime, or if the offender is still present at the scene, then officers will always be dispatched if available to those zones. So that's been our first movement. And then on the 1st of October, we changed our concern for welfare processes. So within Lincolnshire Police, we have calls for concern for welfare which come from a variety of sources, our partner agencies and the public, and can be related to a range of issues. Concerns for people demonstrating mental health symptoms, concerns for missing persons, and a range of other general concerns for welfare, including alarms going off within managed and monitored services. We have drawn up, in consultation with our partners, a much clearer set of arrangements for how we seek to manage those. police will always respond in those circumstances where there is a risk to life or harm to the public. Otherwise, we will seek to place those concerns to the most appropriate agency. What we have found in the early days of running this pilot, and it's been going for 6 or 7 weeks, that we are already seeing from early surveys a saving of approaching 20 hours per day of officer time in terms of what they were doing responding to these calls. We expect that number to grow, but we will report on the number early in the new year when we do a formal study of that work. We expect to carry on work beyond these 2 areas as part of our contact management transformation programme, which is designed with the effect of the force control room taking more information at the initial point of contact and making more decisions around how action should be best taken rather than defaulting to the previous activity, which was to dispatch officers almost irrespective of the potential value that their attendance or action might bring about. And in this way, we hope not only to relieve the demand on our overstretched frontline officers, but also to focus their activity in the areas where they're going to make most impact.
Thank you, Andrew. And a couple of other points on this area. First is that whilst the ability to deploy resources is limited ultimately by their availability and presence, we're not standing still on that. Some of the things that the force has done recently have been to change some of our shift pattern working. So, for example, we've ran a pilot on the east of the county over the summer period to where the response officers were working 12-hour shift patterns to help us better align the availability of resources to the demand which comes in. Also, we're looking at different ways in which we can use the information that we have available at an officer level to be able to better direct their patrol time. And these are things that we've done, and these are some things that we are planning. So I wouldn't want to give anyone the impression that we are just standing still, even with the sort of limited resources that we have available. And the second thing is in relation to the call answering times. And I think that the information that we have available on 101, there was a very good debate, a public debate earlier on this morning in relation to 101, and the superintendent in charge of the force control room did very well, I felt, in his explanation and in relation to some of the questions raised. The fact for me is that I completely understand this is an area of understandable focus and from the public, and therefore from the Commissioner's office and indeed in our own team. Equally, I will continue to look at ways in which we can use the systems that are available to us to answer calls and to give people an understanding as to when their call will be answered. The fact that with 60,000 calls coming in over the 3-month period, July to September, that 99.9% of them were answered inside 10 minutes, regardless of the time of day or day of the week, I think tells us that the problem that we're looking at is very kind of localized to some small kind of numbers in that general envelope. But in the meantime, we've already made some changes to the experience of someone calling 101 to Lincolnshire, and we have got other things that we will be doing with the system, the telephone system, in the next 12 months that will again allow a member of the public to have more information about where they sit within a call queue, if indeed at the time they call there is a queue, and secondly, will also allow them to do some self-direction in relation to where their call goes, which should improve the whole management of the system. So there are things we've done, there are things that we are again planning to do, and as it stands at the moment, almost 100% inside 10 minutes, and I think there are some positives within there, but I do understand that certain members of the public, when they call, are still feeling frustrated at the length of time.
Thank you for that. And yeah, just picking up on a few of those points, I guess the difficulty is, and I know you know this, that you never know why somebody's calling. So, you know, we heard, as you say today, people on the radio saying, well, I've been waiting over 40 minutes, 50 minutes, which clearly is not the typical experience of somebody calling 101. That said, we don't obviously want public confidence to be undermined by hearing those things in the public forum. It is absolutely vital people contact the police to report things, to pass information to you, to report crimes, whatever the reason they're calling that non-emergency number. I think the one thing that didn't come across as well is the fact that there's been that investment in the online reporting portal, so people can obviously report through the website. So if it is something that they can report and it's not time critical, then that is a really good route in as well. So we want to make sure that we build on that. That said, something that gets brought up with me every single place I go is around 101 and the fact that the public's expectation is that if they're ringing to give you information or to report something, that they want it to be answered in a timely way. Defining what timely means is going to be a very personal thing to different people. So, you know, within 10 minutes might be an acceptable standard to one person, within 2 minutes might be to somebody else, instantly might be to somebody else. So I accept that you are never going to be able to create that. I suppose from my point of view, one of the things we've discussed for a number of months is around, well, what would it cost to see any improvements in there? And I think we still need to explore that to understand, well, okay, what are the choices around that, because it's the shop front that most people want to use to contact the police at this stage. So what are the options around that? And that's something to take away and look at so that we can understand, with further investment, what impact could we make. That's a choice. It doesn't mean that that's a choice we will take, but it's a choice. And equally, how can we signpost people to the correct agency without them coming through to the police, because a lot of the calls, as we know, come through are not directly about policing services. And also that differentiator between that sort of 1 in 5 call that's about a crime versus all the other things. And the investment that's been made, that £2.5 million in a new telephony system, has been a good step forward, but equally are we exploiting that as much as we can? And equally then the investment that's being made, over £6 million over the next few years, in a new command and control system, what impact we want from that, and when will we see those improvements come online, so we can reassure the public that all the investments we are making, when they're going to have that impact, when they can see the difference, and that they can have confidence that we do see the way they contact us as being, you know, front and centre as important, so that we can build that confidence for them to report. But that's not so much a critical point around where we are, so much as looking forward and saying what the vision for the future might be.
I suppose my point around it, again, we obviously recognise the importance of the control room. The control room is the heart of the force, realistically. If the control room is working well, the rest of the force is traditionally working well. And that's why, as Andrew touched on there, the work that we're doing around the contact management transformation programme is not just about new technology, but it's a different way of dealing with that calls of service. Again, recognising that about managing public expectation of, and doing the work leading up to the change that we're doing in terms of, if you contact the police or need to contact the police, this is what's going to happen, and talk through people that. I think the reality is, unfortunately, we see lots of documentaries on television about contacting the police, and unfortunately policing is not the same throughout the country. It's not, and therefore we've got to make sure the public of Lincolnshire understand what the response will be if they contact us. Again, recognising we want to be a modern force that's not just about the call into the control room, it's other ways of contacting us in times when it's not so critical, but clearly still an issue that we need to deal with.
And just to give a sense of scale, we do have within Lincolnshire 146 call takers. So this is a very substantial and not inexpensive operation, although obviously we're really alive to the overall cost of it. But for a force that only has 2,000 people broadly working for it in total, our call handling numbers are a substantial proportion of that.
No, I think that's always worth recognising, and the fact that, to be honest, these things are choices. We could have 200 people answering the phone. It would mean 30 fewer cops on the street to achieve that. So it is that balance between we can answer the phone to tell you why we're not coming, or we can get the balance right between answering the phone and then responding appropriately. And I understand that, and I think the vast majority of people will understand that. But equally, the investments we're making in new technology, new ways of working, we want to result in meeting not just their expectation, but the rise in demand, but equally to be able to deliver the best service we can. So I guess as we move forward, it's articulating how all of that is coming together to be able to best serve the public. If I can sort of lead you on to a couple of other points I hope you'll be able to pick up on. In particular, I'm interested in just your view. We've seen some rise in the cases we're dealing with around child sexual exploitation, and it'd be just to get a few words on where you think we are with that. Obviously, they're very complex, difficult cases that lead to not only needing to safeguard very vulnerable people, but also from a demand point of view, that's very labour intensive, so something about that. And in particular, when we're looking at, as a separate subject, the area around forensics. I obviously see a lot of data around this nationally, regionally, as well as locally, and you could read the way Lincolnshire uses forensics in very different ways, because we don't tend to use a scattergun approach of sending our forensics teams to everything, very targeted, so that could be seen as a very good thing, or it could equally be potentially that we're not spending enough money there. So just your comments around those would be great.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'll pass you over to my colleagues in terms of both those points. Essentially, when it comes to child sexual abuse and sexual exploitation, this continues to be an area of nationally rising numbers being reported. Much of this coming through the national reporting mechanisms that exist and the ways in which the investigative equipment available to the police are used around the online nature of much of child sexual abuse, and how that is then being used by forces in order to identify offenders. So there is something about not only the reporting to us by other agencies, but also the ability of the police service nationally to be able to identify offenders and take appropriate action to safeguard children. My feeling is that will continue to rise for some time to come, and that we really, unfortunately, have not yet seen the scale of this problem in its full light. But I'll pass on to, was it CSE you wanted to get to ACC, was?
Thank you. As the Chief said, we will probably see this continue to rise in this particular area, especially the more we have our officers who are more well informed about what to look for, how they proactively tackle CSE when it gets brought to life, how our partners and the work that we're doing with our partners as well to also raise the profile and have them put the referrals into us. We've had a number of proactive operations going on in this reporting period. Op Rochester, which looks at the sexual exploitation of young girls by men from out of the county, and that operation is still ongoing, but we have had quite a few additional referrals in with that, and we've also had a particular offences at schools where people have been reported and brought to our attention for things like upskirting and taking advantage of school children. So all of these things are increased proactive operations that we probably a couple of years ago would have dealt with in a completely different way. So I see this type of thing continuing to increase.
And in terms of forensics, essentially the situation for us, partly due to the large geographic area that we have to cover, is that there is a very robust approach taken to deciding whether or not a scene is worthy of forensic examination. And I specifically talk about that rather than the submission of forensic samples for other reasons, such as drink or drug driving offences. Where that's seen as of a serious nature, then there will always be the attendance of a forensic investigator, and we play the kind of full part in submissions to the regional forensics setup that we have, which actually has got the kind of accreditation that other areas would really wish to have. We've got one of the best, if not the best, regional forensics capabilities in the country. The issue really is about the attendance of other scenes, and we make a very, as I said, robust choice as to whether or not we should put a forensics investigator to those areas. Now, what that does mean is that they attend comparatively fewer compared to others, for example, in our region, but that the strike rate, the return rate on those examinations is higher. So it's under constant review by the head of crime, and we indeed, as the Chief Officer team, and indeed I know your office as well, we get regular reporting from the regional forensic services as to the number of investigations that take place and the number of successful identifications. So we are regularly, and as far as head of crime is concerned, constantly reviewing the policy around the allocation of a crime scene investigator to ensure that we are getting the best for our money, I suppose, is one way of describing it, but that we're getting kind of good value for the service itself. That, I hope I can understandably says that you could do more. You could either put a bit more money into it, or you could ask for a higher demand to the service. But in that, you'll get quite a lot of additional failure. So you'll get people attending where, in fact, there's no positive forensic opportunity, or indeed, if there is a forensic opportunity, it doesn't then result in any kind of positive identification. And that's a choice, because compared to other forces, some of them do that. We feel that we've probably got the level about right in terms of our use of the service. If anything, our current issues are not with crime scene investigation or crime scene examination, it's within the treatment of other samples. So as I mentioned, drink and drug samples and others that we've taken from suspects, where we're trying to push them through the system, and because of issues at a national level, it's been a bit more problematic in recent times to get that workload completed according to a kind of timeline that really helps the criminal justice process. So we continue to push hard on that front. But yeah, okay.
Just to reassure you, Commissioner, that if we do have a particular series of a crime which is causing us difficulty, whether it's in a location or a type of crime which might fall outside of our normal deployment policy for our forensic attendance, then we will put a problem-solving profile together, and then we'll include a forensic strategy that goes alongside that. We're currently investing a lot more in our frontline supervisors to give them much more awareness about investigative strategies and what they can do to actually step outside of the policies that we do. So we're not saying that the policies will actually prevent us doing more as and when it's needed, but we just think much more carefully about how we do that.
No, thank you. That's really helpful, and it's a very sorry situation regarding the child exploitation situation, but we're seeing that national trend for that growth, and equally there's the historic side to that, where we're seeing people come forward for things that they haven't previously reported because previously they maybe didn't have the confidence in the system to take them seriously. So again, we want to make sure that people do come forward, do report, and I've got confidence that they will be treated appropriately by the approach here in Lincolnshire. And again, it's assuring to hear that we've got that very clear approach to the use of forensics here, that it's not just a scattergun approach where it's being used as a fishing trip. It's being targeted appropriately to make sure that you get the maximum impact for the taxpayers' money, really, to make sure that we're delivering the best quality service. So thank you for that. Just moving forward, one area I know you've been leading on, Chief, nationally, is around the appropriate use of release under investigation versus the way that people used to be bailed and then now are bailed. So again, just a few words around that would be really welcome. And also on the same pack, we've obviously got the detail there, which is about the positive crime outcomes, which again is I suppose quite difficult for people to understand, particularly about the out-of-court disposals. So any comments you've got around there, and equally the element where we have had an increased focus in Lincolnshire on our roads, which is all in the same outcome section, which is why I'm lumping those together. Because again, we know that mile for mile we've got the most dangerous roads in the country, so it is something that we're focusing on both from an education point of view, which I had the great pleasure of going to see our first 30 under 25s who were going to take part in their advanced driving courses the other night, but actually that enforcement element that hopefully will lead to people, they might get a ticket but they might get home safely to appreciate paying it. So a little bit about that section of outcomes, if you would please.
Thank you, Commissioner. So I'll deal with the first of those issues. So by way of attempt to explain, again, another area that is quite complex to the operation of the force, and that is what happens to someone when they come into police contact as a suspect or indeed as an accused person. And as you said, one of the mechanisms that used in order to manage someone who is within the category of suspect is the use of a bail condition. So essentially, that is a legal mechanism by which someone's freedoms are restricted whilst they are not in police custody, but they are awaiting the outcome of a police investigation or a court process. And bail has been around for many, many decades, if not centuries. There was a fairly recent change to the law just over a year ago now, which was designed in order to learn lessons from some cases that had been happening over the recent years, where it was felt that individuals who were under police suspicion were spending too long awaiting the outcome, and therefore these conditions attached to their release were essentially infringing upon their rights. So those changes were designed in order to speed up the process in relation to the investigation and balance out the right of society versus the rights of individuals. One of the consequences of that change was that a group of people who are what's called released under investigation, so there is still a police inquiry taking place in relation to an allegation against them, but there is no formal condition on their behaviour, and it's popularly reduced to RUI, released under investigation. So the number of people RUI'd has grown across the country as a result of a focus on the use of bail. What we did in this force is that we led for the East Midlands region in examining what those consequences meant and looking at what could we as an organisation do to better look after, to better manage the process that related to those who were released under investigation, as well as ensuring that we complied with the new legislation under bail. That led to us introducing a new set of guidance for staff, as well as looking at the consequences in terms of supervisory decisions. So where someone is under investigation for a period of time, so initially kind of 4 weeks, the levels of supervision that would be involved in deciding whether that was to continue or indeed whether it was to change to either a new formal condition of bail or not. So basically all of that was being put in place and has been put in place in order to ensure that the individual who is under police investigation is dealt with in as quick a period of time as possible. Equally, that the person making the allegation, so very often a victim, is being supported and that they are dealt with as quickly as is possible, and that the whole system is managed in a way which is transparent and which is lawfully compliant. I'm very kind of pleased to say that what that has meant is that not just for the region but for the country, we are at the forefront of ensuring that all of these issues are dealt with in this force in a way which is recognised now by HMIC FRS and by the national leads within the criminal justice world as being a kind of exemplar. And our guidance has been circulated across the region and indeed wider for others to choose to follow if they so wish. So I think what time will show is that this means that as far as the people with whom we deal with, who are both suspects but also those who are unfortunately on the victim side of that, that both are dealt with fairly and that both are dealt with as quickly as the law and the system will allow. We will continue to update the Criminal Justice Board as to the figures in relation to that, but they are looking in terms of our management very positively. So the second set of issues you mentioned were in relation to the driving enforcement, but you also mentioned the criminal justice outcomes in terms of the positive criminal justice outcomes. So I'll pass the Deputy to the outcomes.
So yeah, and we touched on the outcomes earlier on, Commissioner, but I think you made a particular reference to the out-of-court disposal, obviously, which again is a means to ultimately deal with appropriately, proportionately, in line with legislation for first-time low-level offending. As you'll see here, in terms of our use of out-of-court disposals, which again is ultimately ones where they're not going to go to court, they're not going to report on summons, it could be a ticket, it could be a community resolution, a restorative justice element within it realistically. I think it's fair to say we've got more work to do here in terms of out-of-court disposal. We're using it, probably not using it as much as we could do. Again, the benefit of using out-of-court disposal is firstly, it's proportionate to the investigation we're doing. The reality is it gets justice quicker for victims, and just as importantly, evidence base shows by doing out-of-court disposal with the relevant pathway referrals into the services, you stay straight away reduced, likely reoffending in the future as well. It's a piece of work that I know myself and the Assistant Chief have had a conversation around, and as part of our wider prevention work around offending, this is an area that we know we need to do more work in the coming months, and again links into the ARC piece of work we're doing with the wider partnership as well. So it's an area that we need to do more with. Again, there's some plans how we're going to do that, and again hopefully we'll report the positive trend around that in the future as well.
Commissioner, if I can give you an update on the driving enforcement side of things that we've progressed on. As you know, there was a review of the MOPS, which is the East Midlands Specialist Operations team of the three forces which were collaborating on things such as roads policing. There was a review of that, and we have brought some of our management structures back in force, and we have put in place a superintendent who has the local responsibility for driving up standards in terms of, pardon the pun, for driving standards across how we deliver enforcement. As a result of that, with that very focused localised management, we've been able to put in place a number of initiatives which I think it would be fair to say that we did not have the resource and the oversight on previously. Brought that together, and you can see the positive results that we've had right across all of those fatal four enforcement activities, working very closely with the local road safety partnership about some of the communication and the campaigns that we have across the county. I'm really concerned, as we all are, about the levels of deaths and serious injuries which occur on our roads. You've already made mention of our roads being some of the most dangerous in the country. So there's still more work to do there, but we are tackling the fatal four side of things. We're now putting in place some new initiatives, such as identifying the most dangerous stretches of roads, the top 10, what we will call the red routes, and we'll put additional enforcement and education campaigns in those particular areas.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, I mean, I suppose the custody piece is probably one of those where we are at the forefront of the changes and making sure that they're being used appropriately, which is very much welcome. And I know that nationally there were, before current events overtook things, some moves to look again at some of that decision making that had led to it being in this position. So I know we'll keep a watching brief on that. I suppose regarding the outcomes, particularly the out of court disposals, I'd be very interested to work closely with you to understand that. I know we have the out of court disposal panel which scrutinises the appropriate use of this, but I suppose it's almost a question as to whether, when the out of court disposal is used, whether that's even an outcome. That to me is the input. We've decided what path we're going to set somebody on, but for me, until we know whether that genuinely, what percentage of people that go through that, does it lead to the next 12 months of them not offending, etc. So I think that wider understanding as to what it delivers, that's for me the important bit. So again, I'll be really keen to work with you closely on that. And yeah, I mean, with the driving, obviously, I know that there's a number of different strands, not only the dedicated roads policing element, the Safer Roads team, but also the Community Speed Watch and other things that the force are involved in. And certainly the Lincolnshire Road Safety Partnership is something where I feel that's a key element. We obviously, the partnership between the OPCC, the force and the County Council, and it is now chaired by Malcolm Birch, my Chief Executive, so that we've got that clear steer to make sure that it's effectively delivering for us. But whether there's anything on that you want to comment on before we move on, or whether you're happy. Is that right? Okay, thank you for that. I'll sort of just going on to the section marked satisfaction, which again is always one of those areas that can be read in many different ways. So I'll just throw it over to you for comment.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. The overriding thing I'd say, we've talked about complaints specifically, and so I won't kind of touch on those areas. Essentially, neither myself nor anybody in the executive team is content with where we are around the user satisfaction of our services. It's been too low for too long now. We're too low, still sort of 60, 70%, 75%, which in itself is a particular position. So it's, I'm not saying it's right in the doldrums, but it's not anywhere near where it should be, and it's not anywhere near where we intend it to be. And the element which continues to be the area of difficulty for us to organisationally solve is this area of matching someone's expectation about when they are going to be updated or kept informed of the reason why they contacted us in the first place, and the times at which we are doing that. And that's despite things such as changes to the electronic means by which we can update people, changes to the way in which we manage workflow through our crime recording system. We still are sitting, as it says here, monthly volume around 60% satisfaction with that area in terms of keeping people informed. There's every reason to expect that should be nearer 100%. You know, that is far, far too low. So we are continuing to review the different ways in which we can change the operating model of the force in order to influence that particular figure. Part of that wrapped up is also understanding better the whole issues around those who are satisfied and those who are not satisfied. We currently do that through a survey which looks at just a small number of crime types, and it's a survey which is conducted on our behalf by our colleagues in Leicestershire. We feel that it would be better to bring that in-house, and that we could sort of change the way in which we do it. We've already devised some question sets around it, and clearly understand working with your own office about how we can do different things to get a better understanding of satisfaction on members of the public's part with our service. But I am disappointed it has stayed at this level for so long, mainly because it has been a feature of our quality of service boards, and the collective will of the room is to improve that and to improve it substantially. So it's one area that it's one of any areas that you may wish to kind of look at in more detail, but in the same way that we looked at complaints today and that we looked at violent crime, I think satisfaction levels and the force plan in order to improve, in particular, the keeping people informed is something that I would welcome future scrutiny at in more detail. I don't know if colleagues, yeah, both.
So, again, linking into this, we had the conversation on Friday, Karen, didn't we, in terms with commands recognising where we were at the minute, it's not where we need to be. That's not, we've not been stood doing the thing, obviously, as the Chief touched on there, there's been a conversation at the Quality of Service Board. Again, we've got a number of work streams at the minute, so the Chief touched on about how we currently survey, it's quite limited in the moment, we could expand it further because that's important, get a wider perspective from the public. The second bit is in terms of what do we do with the information when we get it back in, how we utilise that, both to just recognise good work, cause we get some good feedback and positive feedback, but also get areas where we can do better, and particular themes, how we utilise that information. This area of business, the Victims Code, was subject to an internal audit, which again was discussed last week at the Joint Audit Commission Committee, where again there's some recommendations for the fourth which we're picking up, again making sure we comply with the Victims Code. And then the fourth bit for me is again the work that we're doing jointly with yourselves, and particularly Joe, around the victim's journey. Again, making sure we're doing everything we can to support victims, both in terms of initial reporting all the way through the criminal justice process to whatever the conclusion may be around that. I think the bit around it for our side is, look, it's one that we've got to increase the focus on. Some of the challenge around here is about the data that we've got at the moment, how we can make that more visible. Again, that's a wider piece of work we're doing for the organisation in terms of the wider demand piece. But just importantly, this is a good example where if we don't get it right, it's not just in terms of not getting it right for that victim, but it puts extra pressure and demand on the service, because then we get further calls into the control room saying I'm not happy, I've not been updated. We then got complaints, and again, without going into the whole story, but you can see straight away by getting this right first time, we don't just get victims the right service they deserve and expect. We don't just build confidence, public confidence, but second is we reduce some demand in the wider service as well. So it's one we've got to do more with, and as the Chief says, there's some activities around that to do that as well.
Okay, thank you for that. And again, the other sort of, I suppose, data gathering that we do around there. I mean, last 2 years we've completed this sort of quite wide-ranging crime and policing survey. We'll be doing that again, which will be launching in the middle of December. And again, that gives a lot of information about what the public are feeling around that. But on the back of the last one, we have set up a standing panel where we can contact them sort of every quarter to ask them a range of more in-depth questions. And this might be a good area to actually look at people's experiences and actually work with you to actually put some questions together. There's about 1,000 people or just over in that panel, so it's quite a good data set that we can get from that. So happy to help with that. Moving on to the last section, I mean, there's a number of sections in there around resources. Just throw it over to you for comment, really.
Thank you, Commissioner. So, one of the tables talks about our deployable resources and their breakdown. What we can see, and again, when members of the public see the table, make sure you look at the left-hand side, that it starts at 850, it doesn't start at 0, so you might look at that and think that 40% of our resources are not deployable. But so there are some 80 or so officers who are in recovery and recuperative duties. That is not to say that they are doing unproductive work. It just means that they can't be deployed to some of the more physically demanding roles, such as our public order deployments. It would be hoped that they would be able to move towards a situation of being fully fit, and indeed a lot of the well-being and occupational health support is in order to make that happen. What they will be doing is they'll be deployed on other duties which can be of value to the force. Nevertheless, that is an area of scrutiny for us in order to ensure that those people who sit within that role are being used valuably and are on some kind of plan in order to bring them to full duties, if indeed for that individual that's possible. The next kind of part of it is around kind of absence levels. Again, the colours are slightly misleading. If you look at the January going towards today's date, for this entire kind of calendar year, it's generally speaking being an improving position in relation to days lost through sickness absence, and that is the same for both police officers and police staff. Indeed, the picture for police staff is looking really quite positive. That's notwithstanding the fact that as a force, it is a priority area for us. That's one of our 2 goals, quality of service and well-being. And that well-being also looks like the psychological support that officers and staff receive, and we continue to develop different ways in which that can be provided. That does mean that we are encouraging people that where they are unwell to say they're unwell. Presenteeism, i.e. being present but not really physically fit to do your role, is not healthy. It does not help the public or indeed the organisation. So we're encouraging people to come forward so that they can get the right support. That would mean, given the levels of stress and anxiety that exist in the force, which we know from the work we've done through both our surveys but also through work that the Federation and others have done, we know they're high. That would mean we would expect to see more people coming forward and self-declaring the need for help. Once that initial kind of reporting comes through and we can get the help to them, I would hope that in the medium and longer term we would see the organisation become a generally psychologically healthier place to be. So that the absence levels, I think, as I said, generally speaking, an improving picture, but with a lot of other activity that's taking place within them. The final element that's in this section is around performance development review. I am really clear with the team that this is something that we need to do a wholesale overhaul of. Performance development reviews are there to assess an individual's contribution to the goals of the organisation. We also use them as a means by which we can understand the developmental needs, therefore the training needs of an individual. And we have, in the recent past, the last few years, been using them as an opportunity to give an individual support around their general welfare. We've had a number of discussions in the last couple of months around how that will need to change, and we're in the process of putting together what essentially will be an action plan, which very, very happy to share with you around how that will change. There are a number of drivers to it. First of all is, well, as these figures consistently tell us, supervisors are finding it next to impossible to comply with the requirement that we place upon them. So there is only so long you can keep flogging that particular horse when it tells people you must, you must, you must. Well, they're telling us they're finding it next to impossible to comply. So there's something about changing it to a system that is easier to complete, is more relevant, more flexible, and allows an individual's performance to be assessed in an ongoing way with a supervisor, and it could be more than one over the course of an officer's year. Secondly, there is a need to be able to have that assessment around someone's contribution to the organisation in a way which they can agree with or challenge. And PDRs are not currently set up in that way, but there is a real potential, and these discussions are happening at a national level, so there's no public secret on this one, in relation to see how assessment of performance affects pay progression, for example. And therefore we are kind of very keen that we look at that at a very early stage in order to see where we can go in linking an assessment of someone's performance to what could be termed as the reward, whatever reward looks like, whether that's a movement through a scale or whether that's opportunities for promotion or lateral development into other departments. So there's that connection, that driver. And the third element is there is, as I say already, a bit that involves around officers' welfare, but it's not clearly enough defined as far as we are concerned, into that approach to well-being, which is the one that we've adopted as a force. So there are at least 3 very good and pressing reasons as to why a complete overhaul of this is required. There is stuff that we're attempting to do in the meantime around the encouragement for command teams, so that's the management teams at Chief Inspector and Superintendent level, about how they are managing it within their specific area. But what we are presented with today is an illustration of a systemic problem with the system, and what you have from me and from the team is our commitment to do something systemic by way of change. none of that should be news to any of you. So, but if you've got any other additional comment you'd like to make in relation to, no, that covers it. So those were the 3 areas, Commissioner, in terms of resources.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And I know from speaking to other PCCs around the country that it's a very similar picture elsewhere, and it's a problem that the service has been grappling with for some time, and hopefully it will come out the other side of the grappling with something, you know, meaningful that will benefit every officer in the service and equally every police staff member, because it is important that people have the opportunity to raise their concerns as well as feel that they're valued through the organisation, and particularly if it's going to be linked to reward in some way, it's absolutely vital we get it right. So rather than a quick solution, we need a good permanent solution that works. That was all of my questions around that report. Unless anybody else has got anything else they wish to add or comment. Malcolm?
Thank you, Commissioner. I just think there's something that we need to think about for these future meetings, about how we reflect other work that the force does in partnership with others. And the example I'd use would be around outcomes around shoplifting. We've had a very good exposition around the issue and around what we're doing around, if you like, productivity and efficiency. But actually the public are really interested in outcomes. And we know that the work that ACC Wilson is doing around problem solving, the DCC about wider partnerships, working with others, will actually impact on those outcomes as much as our efficiency. And it doesn't come out of our discussions because we're very much focused on the force, and I know it must feel like we're very focused on you today, but actually we know the force is investing in schemes to deal with existing offenders. You know, so there's a resource shift to reduce the impact of known offenders on the public of Lincolnshire. We know the force is investing in partnership with agencies, whether it's around drugs or mental health, to divert potential offenders away from their offending behaviour. And you know, that old Pelian thing about demonstrating the absence of crime is really quite difficult to do. We just don't tease enough of that out. We hear really, you know, persuasive arguments from the ACO resources around what we're doing around efficiency to release officer time, but actually the wider picture needs to come out, and perhaps it's an issue for the DCC and I to discuss about how we bring that out so the force can articulate what it's do with partnership, showcase that, but also tease out where more needs to be done and where you, Commissioner, and our office can help. It just felt like something that was a bit missing out of a really good session for me.
No, I think that's really welcome, and I'm seeing lots of nods around the table, so I'm going to assume that that's an approach that we'll take, so I'll leave that with you and the DCC to take up. So in the absence of there being anything else that anybody wishes to say, I just want to say thank you very much for attending today. The next meeting is the 13th of February, so Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and in fact it'll almost be Valentine's Day by the time we meet again. But I think that's been a really helpful session today, and thank you very much. Song you want me to sing?
No, it's not today. It's going to be a very short one, really. I found this very useful. And as a former magistrate and current member of the RSP, if anyone round that table has a good idea on how those of us who regularly get in touch with our electorates, in mind Sutton Bridge and Long Sutton, as you probably all know, how we can persuade people to report small incidents because they could be the last bit of a jigsaw, I'd welcome any idea how we can do it more effectively. And secondly, and I don't expect an answer, as a former magistrate of a number of years' experience, I have very limited faith in the short, sharp shot, which seems to me like sending someone to college to learn a few new tricks. We lock up too many people, and I think the Chief Constable, Mr. Skelly, briefly touched on it. I have a lot more faith than a lot of people in RJ, which they use widely in restorative justice in Scandinavia, and how can we as individuals get our message across that we actually think trying to reform criminals rather than lock them up and learn new tricks might be a good way to go down with a number of cases. So it's two observations there, and any help, I'd be very grateful. Thank you, Chair.
I would certainly suggest, Chris, on the latter point, in fact, both points, if you wouldn't mind submitting those to us as questions,